welcome to Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. My name is Amanda, and my fabulous co-host is...
Hello, I'm Meagan.
Hey, so this is our weekly book club episode, and we are kicking off a new book this week called The Danish Way of Raising Teens now we've discussed this, I am not good at names, so I'm very sorry if she's listening or anyone here is Danish and is like, how dare she butcher our names so badly. I think this specific book is by Iben Dissing Sandahl.
It is now. If it wasn't before, it is now.
Yeah. And I'm telling you, I watched like 8 videos last night of someone else pronouncing her name in hopes that I would get it right today. And I'm positive I just butchered it. So I'm sorry. I tried. I put in the homework.
I was going to say A for effort, right? Yeah. So if you're new here and wondering how our book club works, I'm so glad you asked. Okay, so number 1, you do not have to read the books if you don't want to. If you want to tune in and listen to our digest version conversation of the books, that totally works. We don't judge. So come, show up. It's totally okay. If you'd like to read the book along with us, that's also totally amazing. We will link the book in the description for this episode. Full disclosure, it is an affiliate link. It doesn't cost you anything extra to use our link, but it does help support our podcast endeavors, and we truly appreciate your support. Number 3, if you'd ever like to join us for a book club episode, send us a DM on social media. Just send us a quick video, like 1 to 2 minutes. Just be like, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'd love to join you for book club because, right? You can find us. We're Homeschool Moms Unfiltered on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. We love getting messages. Like Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, you've got mail. So send us a message letting us know if you'd like to join us for a book club, and we would love to welcome listeners for future episodes. Exciting times.
All right. So now if you heard the title of the book, The Danish Way of Raising Teens, and you were like, I was going to do it this time. I was going to be on the ball and join, but now I shouldn't. Like, I have an 8-year-old and it's time. They're talking about teenagers. Like, don't leave. Okay. Seriously. In the introduction on page 9, she makes a point of saying that she doesn't differentiate between teenager, tween, and preteen. She specifically says this book is for any parent experiencing general developmental and psychological changes in their adolescent children. And honestly, like that starts at, well, actually the book talks about how it starts as a baby, right? The first big version of that is before they turn 1. But truly, by the time your kid is in elementary school, like you're starting to see this and experience this, and it's only going to ramp up for a while, right? So stick around. It'll be helpful.
Exactly. I mean, this week we'll be focusing on the introduction along with chapters 1 and 2, and I can already see tons of stuff that would have been helpful when my kids were in their younger years. So I completely agree with that. So, all right. So I've got the first note for today.
You do look at that. That doesn't happen very often. Go you.
except for the one book about transcripts and portfolios where I like retyped the entire book into our notes because I was having so much fun reading that book. At least in the beginning, I burnt out on it towards the end. But in the beginning, I was like, this is amazing. So on page 4, she talks about the fact that she says, I think the terminology around teenagers has a negative and judgmental character. And I would just like to say, as the parent of 2 teenagers, one of whom I'll have a 3rd teenager in like 3 weeks. I think that's so true. When you say to people like, oh, I have teenagers, there's this kind of like, there's this eye roll or this like look that's like better you than me is kind of what it's conveying, or like, woof, that must be tough kind of thing. It's like what people convey with their looks and sounds and whatever everything else. And I'm like, I have amazing teenagers. Like, I love them. The teenager stage is amazing. We have so much fun. They're like small adults. We laugh so freaking hard. We have inside jokes. They can do more. They're more independent. Like, I love having teenagers. They're not assholes. Like, it's totally possible, right? I mean, they're like, they're not assholes at all. Like, I'm not blind to my children's behavior. Like, they're just amazingly sweet kids, and they're sweet to each other. They get along. Like, it's just amazing, right? And so I feel like then on page 5, she talks about some of the phraseology that gets used around teens, right? And it's so true, like words matter so much. And so she kind of is talking on page 5 about like, we need to uplift our teens, right? We need to support them and show that we're in their corner and that we believe in them and things like that. And this societal view of like teenagers are all assholes is like not helping the situation, right? So
Yeah.
be part of the solution, not part of the problem. It is possible to have nice teenagers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that happens, right? Like, and a lot of it, some of it is definitely kid dependent, right? Some kids are more flexible and go with the flow than others, and all of that kind of stuff. But a lot of it too is how you choose to parent and how you choose to deal with things. I know when my kiddo was younger, we didn't really experience the terrible twos or the three-nagers. Like, we didn't have those specific things. Now, did that mean that everything was always like easy going? No. I mean, like, there were times when he would throw a tantrum and cry, and it would last so long that I eventually learned that if I recorded him and sent it to his nana, that stopped him like dead in his tracks, right? Like, he did not want nana to see him throwing this fit. So yeah, I use that sometimes. And there was a time when, like, I think he was 4, and he got so mad at me over something that he took one of those, those IKEA table and chair sets that it seems like everyone has for the little kids. He flipped that entire table like a bad scene from Real Housewives. And I was like, oh my God. Like, I was like at my pediatrician, like, oh my God, is he going to be like abusive and like and she was like, no, it's totally normal. It's okay. And I'm like, book. I need a book. Give me a book to read about this, like, but all of my friends, everyone I knew was like, oh, he's so good. He never causes any problems. You never have any, he's so gentle. And he's a great kid, but he's still a kid, like, he still went through all of these things, but I can still confidently sit here and say, like, we didn't have the terrible twos. He wasn't a three-nager. Like, we didn't have any of those horror story things. Like, we had some crazy things, right? But not those things. Like, he was just a kid.
Well, and you say like, he wasn't terrible, but he was still a kid, right? On top of that, I think you can broaden it to he's a human being. He's going to have rough days. He's going to have shit days where he just doesn't feel like, doing the thing, or, he has preferences that are different from yours, but he doesn't have the ability to vocalize that, right?
That's it.
And
he
so
does
it's
not
like,
yet know how to say, I cannot people today.
right.
I cannot kid today. There are
I will
days
flip
that I
this
get
table.
up. Yeah, there are days that I get up and I'm like, I cannot adult today. Do not ask anything else of me today. And he did not yet know how to say, like, look, I cannot kid today. Please don't ask me to play. Please don't ask me to put together another puzzle. Like, I cannot kid today, or I'll flip a table.
It's like, we have the ability to say that, but for some reason, so many people don't think their kids like have the luxury of having those days. It's like, just, buck up, friend, like, get it done, and it's like, but we get to have that. I mean, on Saturday, I had the laziest day on Saturday. I was just freaking burnt out. Like, I was so done, right? Our kids have those days too, right? And if we expect to be able to do that and have that level of autonomy, we have to let them do the same thing, right? We have to let them be able to do that. So, yeah. So chapter 1 is then all about authenticity, and it's called the transition phase. So I picked up the one word that I really picked up on page 15 was uncertainty. She talks about, the teenage years being a time of uncertainty and high expectations. And I think I know for my own kid now, one of my kids is very, 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 very private, right? And so even when I am trusted with information from like deep within the reserve, it's like sacred, right? Because that's just how that kiddo operates. So I'll be very cautious about how in depth I share. But I know we've had a lot of conversations about uncertainty, kind of this like, why am I here? What is the whole purpose of all of this? What am I supposed to do with myself? There's a lot of that and even if it's not being expressed, it might be in there, which she kind of talks about as well on page 17, where she says it has become more common to talk about bodies, feelings, and boundaries, and that is positive. But I find that insecurities and the most vulnerable thoughts remain an inner dialogue, despite a greater openness to many other things, right? And so every once in a while, I get a glimpse into some of that uncertainty with one kiddo, where it's like, I just don't even know what the purpose of this whole situation is, right? Like, and that's in there, but you're not getting that on the day-to-day basis. So I think like understanding that I mean, I'm 43. I haven't figured this whole shit show out, right? Like, and I don't feel that I put any pressure on my kid. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And where are you going to go to college? And what are you going to do? Like, it's very organic in our household. And even without me exerting that external pressure, it's still there, right? There's still, it's just this internal thing that's still churning. And so sometimes it's more stressful than others.
Yeah. I think that's super true.
Yeah.
So my next comment was on page 18, and to give you an idea in general, she's kind of laying out, so far she's laid out who she is, and she's a psychiatrist. I don't remember for sure which one, but she definitely works with young adults and teens in a therapy setting of some sort.
Psychotherapist.
Okay, a psychotherapist. And also she is from Denmark, right? It's the Danish way of raising teens. And her quote says, "Sometimes I may have sounded a little too bombastic or even moralistic." And it just really struck me because I know a few Danish folks, right? We had some good friends at one point, a surprising number of Danish friends. And I feel like that statement is pretty culturally relevant and kind of sets a bit of the tone of this book, at least so far, right? Like, there's just a tone to the book, and I think it is significant to be aware of the fact that that's a little Danish.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's a little Danish.
There's a directness, Yeah, exactly. I enjoy some of the cultural videos that I see on Instagram and stuff. There's this one guy who does videos about Dutch culture and like how direct the Dutch are, where, he'll be like, "You changed your hair. Why?" And he'll like act out these skits and whatever, and like, and so just to understand that, like, not everybody is as saccharine sweet as Americans at least portray. Externally, right?
Yeah.
And she does not do that thing. She is Danish.
Yeah, she is. You say this is a total digression, but we had some really good friends when we lived in Europe who were from the Netherlands, and super, super devout Christians, and like socially liberal, but very, conservative Christian, which happens outside of the United States a lot more than it happens within the United States. But I will never forget how easily and freely they cursed. And all of the others in our group, like, we were the only ones that didn't go to church. Everyone in that group went to a church, most of them to the same church. That's how they knew each other. And then we were these kind of outliers of like, hey, as long as you're like open to all of the things and, you're like LGBTQ plus friendly, and all of those kind of stuff, like, you go on with your bad self in your church, like, we can make this work. And all the other conservative churchgoers were like, and our Dutch friends were like, what? It's just a word. Like, it's a word. What's wrong with it? Like, just those differences, cultural differences are so fun.
It's true.
So for me, I have a few comments over the next couple chapters where some of these things stood out to me that I was a little like,
How very Danish of you.
Yeah.
I did love the fact on page 20, she talks about communication, and she talks about the need for mutual respect. And that's been kind of, for me, the foundation of parenting, right? Is like, you see these things that circulate and people give them like the haha emoji on Facebook and stuff like that. But it's like, these things where it's like, oh, you want the Wi-Fi password? Here's the list of chores. And then you can text me photos of them all being finished and you can have the Wi-Fi password, right? And I'm like, they live in our house. They're part of the family. They're equals in so many ways, right? Like, they don't pay the bills and stuff like that, but they're equals in so many ways. And so I like to kind of compare things to other things to give me, common ground, right? So my thought is like, would I treat a neighbor that way? Or like, if I had a relative who came to stay at my house, would I treat them that way? And it's like, why would I treat my own children? Sorry, itchy nose. I talked in our previous episode about having, it's a very allergy heavy day. There's a lot of tissue action. But that they're humans, right? And we want to demand respect from our kids, but they don't always get that level of respect from adults, right? And so, and then parents get really annoyed, like, why are they so disrespectful? And I'm like, well, and sometimes just for funsies, like when I see a post like that in a parenting group or a Facebook group or whatever with homeschooling, I'll click on the person's name so I can see their post history in the group, right? And you see like that they've said horrible things about their kids or something like that, right? And I'm like, unfortunately, that's how it works, right? Like they are human beings and they are not just going to give you undying respect because you birthed them or you feed them or whatever, right? Like that's just not how it works, right? I mean, if you think about it in terms of a marriage, like if your significant other is the provider and this, that, the other thing, like, does that mean you have to submit to their every will and desire? Like, not really, right? I mean, you still have a voice.
I mean, if you're listening to a different podcast, maybe, but
exactly. I just saw something the other day. It was that stupid umbrella metaphor that they use in the IBLP. And it was this lady up on stage and she's standing there and her husband's behind her holding the umbrella. And she's talking about how if I take a step to the left and, if I veer outside of my husband's umbrella of protection. And I was like, oh, for fuck's sake. So, that's not this podcast though, right? But like, that mutual respect thing was so huge. So that's on page 20, which I love. And then the other thing on page 20 that I thought was interesting was she talks about the fact that her kiddos, she had 2 daughters, if I remember correctly, and that her kid would come in late at night and crawl under the blanket and ask all the questions that she needed answered to get the peace of mind to fall asleep. And in our other book club, I don't know if you were in this one, Amanda, because we read at one point something about like the 7 stages of shepherding your daughter into adulthood or something, and you not having a daughter might not have joined that book, I'm not sure. But it was by Dr. Lisa D'Amour, who amazing mental health professional. I don't know if she's a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And she talks about that late night phenomenon with teens, right? That is when they are open. That's when they're ready to chat. And oh my gosh, you're so tired. And it's like midnight and they come in. And a lot of times mine will come in and it's just goofy time and they're like goofing around and whatever. And then they'll kind of settle and you feel the energy change. And then they're like, I was thinking about something for next year and like I kind of wanted to know your thoughts. And I'm like, okay, and you're so freaking tired at this point in the day, but that's the time, right? And it is what it is. And I've read it in multiple parenting books. So it is what it is. And if you want to have that connection with them, I mean, I've been up till 2 a.m. sometimes, but I'm like, the meat I have gotten between 1 and 2 a.m. is worth its weight in gold. So I do it. And it's not going to last forever. And when it's gone, you'll be like, oh man, remember when we used to stay up until 2 a.m. talking? So I do it. I take a nap the next day. It's all good. But
that's it. One of these days they're going to move out of your house and they're not going to drive across town and crawl into your bed at 1 a.m. to talk to you about the big things. Right. Yep. So enjoy it while you can. Yeah. For real. All right. So the next one, we both marked the same paragraph. So it's on page 23. And I'll just read, I don't know, the first half, maybe 2/3. And if you feel like we need to cover more, feel free to go ahead. So it says, the reason for mood swings is to be found in the brain. Now, this applies because we were just talking about brain stuff in our last episode. So if you didn't listen yet, go back and give it a listen.
And you might be listening and thinking like, wow, they are really epic at weaving their content together. It was a total freaking accident that these things got lined up on the same
We are not that epic.
But you can think that all you want.
Yeah. Except we just outed ourselves, but that's okay. All right, so it says, the brain, it undergoes a significant rewiring twice in life. In the first years of life and again during puberty. After your baby is born, myelination.
Myelination?
Yeah, that's how it is. I'm like, I know I'm not getting it right, but I can't remember how it is actually. Okay, so basically a process of nerve insulation occurs in the posterior areas of the brain that are responsible for sensing and movement. After a year, your baby can start walking and standing. During puberty, there is a development of this insulation and a branching of the nerves of the frontal lobes of the brain, which represents your teenager's cognitive abilities, empathy, and consciousness. The brain is simply being rebuilt, and lots of new connections are emerging in these areas that enable your teenager to better put themselves in the place of others. Again, that idea, like, it's beyond their control, right? Like they're not the ones that went in and like flipped the switch in their brain. Like, okay, now is the time. Go ahead and start making all those changes. I'm ready. Right? They are just along for the ride.
Yeah, I loved that section as well because it really did make sense. I mean, if you think about it, right? I know not everyone who's listening to us who identifies as a mother will necessarily have birthed a child or experience postpartum things and like that, right? But like, I mean, I remember I cried over tortilla chips at one point when I was pregnant with my oldest child, right? And it's that same concept, right? Like, I mean, clearly I am a fairly rational human being. My husband might say otherwise. I don't know, but like I'm a fairly rational human being, and someone touched my tortilla chips, and it was just like the end of the universe, right? And so it's like we've had that as well. I mean, if you have experienced pregnancy hormones, some people may not have that when even as a pregnant person it might just not affect you the same way. Maybe you never cried over tortilla chip, good for you, you know. I mean, or the postpartum hormones, you know, that some people experience, some obviously far more significantly than others, but I think even people who experience somewhat typical postpartum, you know, hormones ups and downs, right, it's still a bit of a roller coaster, and it's the same concept. We're not in charge of it. Yeah, I mean, I cried over some really stupid stuff, right? But you have no control, and they're the same, right? So you know, and it is what it is, right? They're trying their best, and man, they're being bombarded from like every freaking direction with stuff going on, and big feelings and big requirements and a future that's unknown, and all of that. It's tough.
Yeah. Yeah. So then if you go to the next page, there's this quote that I was torn on, right? Because in some ways I felt it was insightful. And then in other ways I was like, eh. So the quote says, when your teen suddenly goes from laughing to crying to shouting to silence, remind yourself of the 90-second chemical process that happens in your teen's body. After all, after that, any remaining emotional response is simply the teen choosing, usually unconsciously, to stay in the emotional loop. Something happens that may only be sensed unconsciously, and chemicals are flushed through their body. This means that for 90 seconds, your teen can watch the process happening, they can feel it happening, and then they can watch it go away. And so for me, it was like, okay, that's a good point, right? This idea that like something has, I know triggered is like an overused word, right? But something has triggered a response in their body, and they have this massive tidal wave of emotions that cause something. And it's physiologically, it takes 90 seconds for this wave to kind of wash over them and then recede. Okay, like that's how I thought of it, because maybe because we were at the beach this weekend. But it's like, okay, that's a good thing to keep in mind, right? That's helpful, that's useful. In that 90 seconds right then, they don't have control over anything, right? Like there's nothing you can do when the wave is coming in. You can't be like, stop, wave, I want to move out of the water, right? Like you're just like, oh, damn, I wasn't far enough away from the shore. Like, gotta move when it's done. The flip side is, I don't necessarily agree that after 90 seconds, you can choose to be like, okay, well, I'm done with that now, right? Like, for me personally, I know when a really big something happens and I have that big emotional wave of any type, right? My heart goes crazy. It's beating out of my chest. I'm shaky. My hands are sweating. Good, bad, or otherwise, right? That's my body's reaction to any big hormonal thing. And it does not calm down in 90 seconds, no matter how much I wish it did, right? And now that's a whole other thing, right? And I'm on heart medication to help make it calm down faster because it just doesn't on its own. But like, so I don't know what you took away from it, but I was like, on the one hand, I'm like, oh, that's really good information. On the other hand, I'm not necessarily like, well, at 90 seconds, if you haven't stepped out of it, that's your problem.
Now you're
like,
just being a jerk. Right?
Yeah. Now you're just wallowing. Okay, move on. Like the timer went off. It's 91 seconds. Choose to let go.
I mean, I think you're spot on there. I didn't necessarily pick up on it in the reading, but the ironic thing is, I probably didn't pick up on it because I had a really hard time concentrating on my reading this week, because I mentioned in our last episode, our Tuesday episode for the week, that our house is for sale. And yesterday was just like a mess, right? It was like we got an offer and it was negotiations and it was this and that. And I was super stressed, right? it lasted longer than 90 seconds. I'll tell you that much right now, right? Like, and
Yeah.
so I had a hard time where I found myself having to go back in the reading and continue to reread stuff because I was like, I just read all of that and I have no idea what it says, right?
Mhm.
At one point I put my book down and took a 40-minute nap. I was like, this isn't going anywhere. So yeah, I mean, I've shared before, I'm an incredibly anxious human being. And it lasts a hell of a lot longer than, I mean, I could go 90 days on an anxiety attack, right? Like, 90 seconds is not a realistic thing for me, but I like the rest of her sentiment there. I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So during that tidal wave of emotion, we both noted the same thing on page 25, which is no child, teenager, or an adult can talk sensibly when they are emotionally upset. Whew, don't we know it, right? And how many people want to try to fix the thing in the moment when one or both of you are fired up still, right? And it's like, this just isn't going anywhere positive.
Mm-hmm. I think that quote, that short, simple quote you should take it and go into Canva and make just a thing, attribute it to her, and we'll stick it on all of our social media channels, right? Like it's one of those things. It's simple. We all know it, but sometimes you really just need it to be a freaking meme of like,
Yeah.
yes, I saved that on my phone to go back and remind myself that it is okay. This is normal. No one, when you're in that moment, can actually be sensible. Like,
Yep. Yeah, it's so true. I mean, not to compare our children to pets, but we have a 2-year-old Bernedoodle who went to service dog training, and after she left service dog training, it was like transition to us. We did like, there was a bunch of handoff training and tandem training and all kinds of stuff that went on before she came to us. But one of the things the trainer said is like, if she does get fired up about, I mean, she's still a dog, right? Like as much as she's been trained, she's still a dog. There's still times where something's going to happen and something's going to set her off, or she's going to bark at something or whatever. And she was like, when she's doing that, she can't hear you. Like she literally cannot hear you when you're trying to stop her, because she has gone into full, like, I must defend my house against the UPS man mode, right? Like, and like talking to her is going to make no sense, right? And like, yeah, I get our kids aren't dogs, but it's the same concept, right? Like, so I have to like physically touch her when she, if she gets fired up about something, it's usually stranger danger, which she only has at our house. Outside of our house, she can go to a restaurant and lay under the table and do her job very effectively. But at home, she's like, that damn UPS man's back again. But I have to touch her to like get her to come back, and so it happens,
Yeah.
and we have to understand that about our kids. I know that's been a parenting difference between me and my husband, where he's trying to like bring logic into the conversation, or like, prove his side of the situation. And I'm like, not now. You are doing nothing but making this worse right now. Like, just let the kiddo chill out. You chill out. And then later we can have a really great conversation about this, but it's not now, right?
Yeah. Not right now.
Yeah. Not now. Not happening. Right.
Yeah.
All right.
So now this next one, I think we're getting back to more familiar territory for the two of us, where we read the same thing. We took totally different things out of it. So we're on page 27, and she's giving some statistics. She says psychology experts at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada, did a study, right? And they found that the human brain, the average person will typically have more than 6,000 thoughts in a single day, followed by thousands of associations that follow that thought. So now we're getting up to like, I mean, just ridiculous
multiples,
numbers.
exponential.
Exactly. Right. And so of the more than 6,000 thoughts a day, 80% were negative, and 95% were repetitions of precisely the same thoughts as before. Then she goes on to talk about another study from Cornell University, where scientists found that 85% of what you worry about never happens, and 15% of worries that did happen, 79% of the subjects discovered that either they could handle the difficulty better than expected, or it taught them a lesson worth learning. And then concluded that 79% of your worries are baseless and result from an unfounded pessimistic perception. and I was like, holy smokes, that's a lot of negativity. Like, I can't know that I don't understand. I don't understand those numbers.
Yeah, it is an interesting study, and you wonder like how they classified things or knew how to. There's not enough detail here to know, right? Yeah, but they
Mm-hmm.
are staggeringly negative. Now, the funny thing is, I didn't find them as alarmingly negative as you did because I do that, right?
Yeah.
Where I will immediately be able to tell you the 10 horrible things that can go wrong. And then of those 10 horrible things, like let's say number 6 is the one that's going to be the one that plays out, right? I can tell you all of the cascading issues that will come from that one as well, right? Like, and I could have
Mm-hmm.
done that for all 10. So, to me, that seemed quite normal, you know,
Yeah.
right? And so, I put a thing, I just made a note in the column on the side column on 27 here, right? So I am like okay, if you're younger than us, this might not make a ton of sense to you, but after 9/11, we had these terror alert levels that came out, right? And so we were on red immediately after 9/11, and then a little bit after that we went to orange and yellow and stuff like that, right? And the terror alert at the time was linked to things like airport security and like, you know, like we used to have like curbside check-in, and then if we were at a certain terror alert, you couldn't, you know, do curbside check-in, or you couldn't even pull underneath the little overhang at the airport sometimes, like to drop
Mm-hmm.
someone off or something, right? So I live a lot of times at the red terror alert level. It's just where I spend my days. And so it was funny because one time I was talking to the rabbi at synagogue about something. I forget what I was even there for, but I'm sure I was worrying about something. And he's so great. He's just so calm and he's so good, right? And he goes, um, so all these things that are like catastrophic, they're going to completely end your whole existence, right? All this stuff. He's like, how many times do they actually happen? And I was like, well, they don't. But if I worry about them in advance, then I can't be caught off guard, you know? And he was like, that's a lot of energy, right? And she talks about that here. It says these baseless worries are a major source of stress and tension and a cause of exhaustion. Hello, not only for the mind, but also for the physical body. And so it was just one of those things where now I go, hold on, this is a red terror alert that's probably not going to happen. Like I think I can set this aside. I think I can stop worrying about this. And so the numbers didn't seem that alarmingly negative to me because I think they're quite standard for my brain.
Yeah.
But you know,
Whereas,
though, like that like kind of is not a mnemonic device, but that little like helpful sentence that he gave me, I was like, okay, and I still use it. It's been probably a decade, and I'm still like, okay, we're not going to hit the red terror alert because it's not going to happen. It
yeah.
doesn't work all the time, but I try.
Yeah, I guess for me, and I'm not going to say I don't ever have the negative thoughts, right? Because I'm definitely the kind of person where, like, okay, so we've got this new situation coming up, and like, what's the best that can happen? What's the absolute worst thing that I can think that can happen? You know, how would we handle the absolute worst thing that could happen? What are some options for handling something that might come up in the middle there? And once I've sort of worked out like 3 or 4 potential scenarios with like the best and the worst, bookending it, then I'm like, okay, well, I know I can handle the best or the worst, so I can handle any of it. And I definitely, for better or worse, I tend towards like the silver lining be the kind of person. I don't know if you picked that up through the podcast, those of you who are listening. But on many occasions, my mom has been like, Amanda, I do not want your silver lining. Okay, like just stop. I don't want your silver lining. And I'm like, okay, but I have a good one.
Just let me get one out, please, please, please. You know?
I have
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's probably why it hit us a little bit differently on that one. But I can, once I saw your note, I was like, oh yeah, those are really negative stats. Like, you know, I was like,
yeah,
oh, okay.
interesting.
To tie that in though, I thought on page 28 was interesting. So this book isn't specifically about homeschooling. Homeschooling isn't super popular in Denmark. It is legal, but not super popular. Right. So, but to tie this in, she says, But you can teach your teen to take warning signs seriously. Symptoms like headaches, abdominal pain, mood swings, or difficulty concentrating should not be ignored. You can also help them understand spinning thoughts and where they come from. And she's described that concept as kind of that spiraling here, right? But I thought it was really interesting because how many times do we see or hear about kids who, like, the parents are like, you notice how their stomach only hurts on school days, right? And it's like, but I'm like, that is a physical manifestation of stress or angst or whatever. Like, if your kid and you're like, oh, they only have a stomach ache when they don't want to do something. Well, what is it about that thing that's causing that, right? Because if we go back to the page before where she says, you know, it's a major source of stress and tension that can cause exhaustion, not only for the mind, but for the physical body. And we talked in our episode this week about how our kids' brains are still developing at this point, hardcore, right? And so they're growing physically, their minds are growing. And so for them to be feeling this level of stress, like, if they're having that physical manifestation of stress, let's try to figure out what's causing it. And maybe we could make some changes, because we wouldn't want to live under those conditions all the time and just have people mock us for it and be like, oh, you notice how she only doesn't want to do this, so that's why she has a headache, you know, or whatever. Maybe we could get to the bottom of it. I'm just saying.
Right? I mean, ideally, I would hope that most of the people who are listening to this are on the same page with us on that. I have a friend who, she's divorced, and her kiddo really struggles with public school. And for a lot of reasons, that's what they continue to do, right? Because they're in a position where that is their answer for right now. And he has a lot of bad migraines and stomach aches and things like that around school. And her ex is like, yeah, you need to take him to the doctor and figure out what's wrong with him. Like it's something else, you know, it's not school related, it's something else. And they've done the whole workup, you know, and all of that. And the doctors are like, you know, he really needs to see, you know, he needs to see someone for mental health if this is going to continue, you know, like there's a lot of stuff going on, and that the only way to address it at this point is this. And her husband's like, he's not a sissy, he doesn't need mental health, like figure out what's wrong. Like, well, I hate to break it to you, but the doctors figured out what they think is wrong, and you don't like the answer, you know, like you don't like any of the answers. I have a pretty good idea why you're not married anymore. Like,
that'll do it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Physical manifestations of stress, they're real, and they should be noticed. And noticed in your kids, right? Kids and teenagers, they're going to feel it even more than adults, because those hormones are raging out of control for no fault of their own. The same as, you know, so yeah. All right. Moving on page 31, she kind of starts moving into a new, she's been talking about it off and on, but now she's going to start really talking about boundaries. So she says, quote, "Teenagers need boundaries set by us. When we set boundaries, we create a predictable environment that means our teens know what will happen. They need to be with someone who dares to be an adult." And that quote in and of itself, I'm like, yeah, okay. You know, like I do agree with that. I do believe, you know, all kids of all ages, all people, right? They need to know the boundaries. They need to know the rules of the game that they're playing, right? The game of life, whatever that game is at any given time. But in the context of the book, I felt like it was a little off-putting.
She's being very Danish again.
Yeah, maybe just a little Danish. Because and the thing that I think is interesting is I agree with a lot of what she's saying, right? You know, she's talking about this, like, you know, not the, what is it? The not authoritative parent, but I can't remember all of the terminology, but basically, like, you know, the parent that sets the guidelines and the rules, but is also understanding and willing to listen, and how that's a good version versus the, like, these are my rules, it's my way or the highway, or the, like, super permissive parent who is like, rules, what rules do you want, honey? And so I think generally, like, we're on the same page about a lot of the things she's saying, but then sometimes she puts it down that I'm like, oh, I think the wrong side of the kettle here would be like, yeah. Did you read that, honey? So then she goes on to say, today, as I see it, There is a lot of misunderstanding about roles. Far too many parents pass on too much responsibility to their children. Quote, what do you think we should do this weekend? What do you want for breakfast? Where do you want to go on holiday? But it is a misunderstanding of eye-level parenting. Being their ally isn't the goal. You are not their friend. You are their parent, their active adult decision maker whom they need to rely on. And I was just like, again, like, yes, I agree. There's some truth to that, right? Like, I have seen it in people that I know where they're really like, yo, you're 14. Like, you're on your own now. Figure it out. Like, let me know what you need and maybe I'll provide it for you. But like, you're basically an adult. Good luck.
I've done my job.
Yeah. I know people who feel that way. And I'm like, I'm not about that. But I mean, you know, at the same time, I'm like, I've been mostly letting Winston pick his breakfast since he was 5. So like, I don't really think like, what do you want for breakfast today? Or like, hey, you know, the last 3 holidays, we've done things I really wanted to do. Like, is there something you really want to do? What are you thinking about? Like, I don't see how those conversations are bad. And
well, especially since we just talked about mutual respect like 4 pages ago. So it feels like, hold on a second. Yeah. I mean, I struggled with this one because I wrote on in the margins on 32 where it says being their ally isn't the goal. And literally being the ally saved my relationship with my youngest child almost a decade ago now, right? Where, you know, I'm an only child. So to me, the concept of having 3 different kids who were all really close in age, who were being raised basically simultaneously, the fact that they could be completely different humans, that's going to sound so stupid, but it did catch me a little off guard because I'm like, well, I'm treating you all the same way, right? You know, but I didn't have a sibling dynamic to like see how even within the same household, you could be so vastly different from one another. It was an interesting kind of awakening for me. And then on top of it, my first 2 are at that age were fairly similar enough that parenting the same way was working. As they've gotten older, they've needed something different. They've diverged, you know, a bit. But my youngest, parenting him that way was a nightmare, right? And it just wasn't working. And the number of times that he and I both were in tears during a given day was epic, right? My husband would come home and I'd be like, just take him. And he'd be like, what do you want me to do with him? I'm like, I don't care. Just take it. I just need a break. Like, I can't do this, right? It was exhausting. And I didn't know what to do. And then one day, I think he was like 3-ish, maybe almost 4. I can't quite remember. And I was literally sitting in the hallway outside his bedroom crying, and he was in his room crying, right? I mean, we were just having one of our days. And I was like, this isn't working, right? In our last episode, we talked about like, if something's not working, you're allowed to change it, right? And so finally I was like, this isn't working. I'm the grown up. He's 3, maybe almost 4. Like, he's not going to be the one to change the situation. This is on me. I got to figure this out. I got to do something different, right? And at that point, you're like locked in a battle of wills because you're saying, do this, and he doesn't want to do that. And the more I pulled, he pulled back harder. The more I pushed, he pushed back harder, right? And so finally, like that day, I sat down with him and I gave him a huge snuggle. And I was like, I've been noticing that you're struggling to make great choices. Like, is there something that is maybe preventing you from being able to make the choices that I feel like, you know, are great choices to make, you know? And mind you, he's almost 13 now, but he's, you know, he's hyperlexic, he's autistic, he's ADHD, he was ridiculously gifted at a very early age that I could have those kinds of conversations with him. And he was like, yeah, I'm really stressed about XYZ. And I was like, okay. And so he and I came up with mantras that were really short and sweet. And so like one of them one day, it was kind and something else. I forget what kind and calm. That was what it was. I'm like, hold on, I should know this. I've said it enough. Right. And so he and I would sort out just a really short mantra all the time. And it was one of these things that if he started to like ratchet up and get himself all worked up, I could be like, remember, I'm here as your partner to help you. And we're going to do this together. Our goal is, and he'd be like, kind and calm. And I was like, exactly. Right. And I learned that whenever he was behaving in such a way that before made me want to run away from home, he needed a really big hug. right? He needed a huge snuggle. He's a sensory seeker, like all that stuff. So, being an ally saved my relationship with him, gave him a partner that he so desperately needed when he couldn't figure out how to regulate. And for me to step in and say, I am here as your partner and I will help you figure out how to regulate. And you can tell me what's causing you to be out of sorts and we'll figure out a plan together, And so it might just be the fact that I specifically would use the word ally with him, and then she uses the word ally that I'm kind of like, I don't know. But for us, it was a game changer.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if maybe I didn't actually look if this was originally written
Did she
in
write it in
English or if it's a
Danish?
translation. Yeah, because I feel like I agree with the fact that you are their parent, not their friend, right? And I do think that that's an important distinction until they hit adulthood, right? You're their parent, not their friend.
Mm-hmm.
But I also feel that you should be their ally. To be a good parent, you should be their ally as well. And I think there's a big difference between an ally and a friend,
Yeah.
right? An ally is there to try to help you achieve the desired goals and outcomes. A friend is there to make bad decisions with you and have a good laugh while you're doing it, and so yeah, I wonder if maybe there's not maybe a translation
Could be.
Vocabulary kind of issue there.
Or even just an ESL thing, like even if she wrote it in
Mhm.
English, but just the nuance of the word could be a little bit different.
Yeah,
But
maybe. Yeah,
being
just in talking through it, that made me think.
yeah, I mean, being that kid's ally, to this day, he knows there's nobody in his corner like me, right? Like whatever difficulty he's having, I'm not going to get upset with him. I'm not going to, like, I will be there to help him, and that he can come to me with anything. So yeah, for us, it was huge. So I wouldn't necessarily think you can't be an ally for your kids, especially, I mean, if you have a special needs kid, like your job is to advocate for them, right? And how are you going to do that if you don't fully understand their needs too?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, in this section, she kind of also goes on and she says, all of these boundaries mean, quote, you will get a teenager who knows the boundaries they must respect and who won't be afraid of confrontation, but rather will see them as something that must be resolved with mutual respect. And I was like, I mean, I'm not entirely sure how the last few pages of what I read is going to get me a teenager who isn't afraid of confrontation and understands that, like, this is the point that we work through these things with mutual respect. But it sounds great, right? So, like, okay.
Well, you can report back in like 3 years when you're in the thick of it. You can, or just starting your journey with a teenager, you could be like, I referenced page 35 in the book, and here are my thoughts. Right?
Yeah, if you're reading along or you're listening to us, she talks about fight, flight, or freeze. She adds in freeze. I feel like a lot of people don't talk about the fact that there are 3. And then she also says that there's a 4th that most people haven't heard of, and that's a fawn-like response to please. This was the first time I'd really read about that, so that was an interesting kind of thing for me. But I personally wasn't crazy about how she kind of seems to write off the freeze response as a response to trauma stored in the brain. And I feel like as a podcast that talks a lot about neurodivergence and things like that, we would be remiss to leave it as the only people who freeze are the people who have trauma stored in their brain. Freeze is a pretty natural response if you have any sort of slower processing speed, which is usually wrapped up in any kind of neurodivergence. Not always, right? But a slower processing speed is not uncommon in kids with neurodivergence. And in these situations, they might fight, but a lot of times they're going to freeze as they try to process everything and figure out, like, I don't understand what's going on. I think I missed something. They said this, and then they said this, and then this happened. Like, why did this? I don't think that's necessarily trauma stored that's coming out, right?
That's a good point.
Maybe just, again, another one of those like cultural differences, or, I mean, not everyone is as sensitive to neurodivergence as we try to be here on this podcast. So I think that's important.
So we're going to continue with chapter 2 in just a moment. But before we do, we'd love to invite you to come and join our Facebook community. If you search Homeschool Moms Unfiltered on Facebook and then click the little button to filter for groups, we chat about life and homeschooling. We have some fun. It's a kind group. Sometimes social media can be a bit of a cesspool. It is not. We will make sure it stays that way. So come and hang out with us if you're looking to find some secular community, some progressive community, and feel free to invite some homeschool friends to come and join you as well.
Yeah, totally.
So chapter 2 is reframing the stars within. Now, I have to say, I was reading this last night and I was like, oh, I can't wait to hear what Amanda has to think about this whole stars concept, because I was like, okay, I need to be open to a different way of thinking, because that's the whole point of this book, is to understand a different culture's way of parenting. But then it got a little like artsy fartsy, hippy dippy, like what, and I was like resisting it. And then I was like, nope, we're supposed to be here with an open mind so that we can learn about how this culture is raising their, okay, they tend to have the happiest people on earth. So I'm gonna be open about this really odd line of discussion, but I'm here for it. So we'll jump into that momentarily. I just want to say that she starts out on the beginning of chapter, page 41, about this like angelic moment where, you know, a choir of heavenly angels sings and a light comes down from the sky and shines upon you as you hold your newborn baby for the first time. And it's pretty sappy and in depth. And I just want to say, as somebody who didn't feel those emotions because my vagina hurt and the kid wouldn't stop screaming, that it's okay if you didn't feel those emotions. You're still a very valid parent, and her experience is just different than some of ours, right? And so it took me a solid 3-ish months to really be like, so he lives here now, huh? Like it took some time, and the doctor was involved and all that kind of stuff. Never once did I envision drowning him in a bathtub or anything like that. But like, you know, not everybody has this angelic newborn mom moment, and that's okay. You are still a rock star parent. So that was my kind of precursor to the chapter, if you're reading along with us.
Yeah, no. And you know what? I'm going to totally second that. This is something that I haven't really talked much about, and I'm certain I haven't talked about it on the podcast, but I had a pretty traumatic birth experience with my only, and I absolutely did not have that, right? Like, I mean, first off, he once he finally made it out into the world, he was unresponsive and immediately whisked away. And so I'm sure that partly played into it, but it was really bad getting him out into the world as well. And to the point where, you know, for the first few days, I was in the hospital for a week. And the first few days for sure, I was aware of the fact that I had these feelings of like, there is this tiny human that is relying on me to provide and care for them. And I did not give birth in the United States. Where I gave birth, you're not allowed to put them in a nursery. There's no such thing as a nursery. You keep the baby. They stay with you the moment they're out, as long as the doctors have got them breathing again. And, you know, and you're caring for that child. And so there was this responsibility, but that was all I was really feeling at that time. To the point where right before I got released from the hospital, those more normal feelings like started to come into play, and it was okay. But I was aware, and thinking like, if I'm still feeling this way at the end of the week when it's time for me to go home, I need to have a very serious conversation with my OBGYN, right? Like, and once I got home, my mom had that same conversation with me where she was like, your dad and I were watching what was happening, and we were definitely a little worried about what was going on there because and your dad was especially worried. And I was like, well, it went really badly. Like, it did not go how it was supposed to go. So like, let's give her a few days to, for things to settle down before we have that talk, right? Because that's a big talk to have with the new mom and with all the hormones and with everything happening, and like, and, I was on some special medications right afterwards and things like that, that probably made things even worse and much harder. But yeah, that thing, we hear it, this idea that like the moment you have your baby, and this, and not enough people talk about the fact that like, that is not a given. And
Yeah.
I would guess, if you really looked at it and if people were really honest that,
They felt comfortable saying it. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that happens significantly less than we are
Yeah.
led to believe. Yeah.
I mean, there was so much that I was the first of my friends to have babies. Nobody told me like, and I grew up in a pretty religious environment where, I didn't get like sex ed or anything like that. Like nobody told me about the mesh panties and the fact that they were going to shove ice packs, into my mesh panties. Like it's like you're there and you're having this like out of body experience, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm freaking exhausted. Food tasted really weird after I was hungry, but I couldn't eat, like the whole thing. And then I was hell bent on breastfeeding, and it went really, really poorly. And every time I turned around, there was somebody in there like manhandling my boobs, and he wouldn't stop screaming because he was hungry. I can't blame him, and like all this, it was not pleasant at all. Right. And I was very excited to become a mom, and I was so excited to meet him, but it didn't go well. Right. And eventually we got there. And then what was great about it was when I had my other kids, I knew that had happened. And so I gave myself some like, I was like, it's okay. It'll come. Like if it's not there. So there was less pressure. But with the first one, I didn't know. And, my oldest is almost 17. A Baby Story was on TLC back then. Do you know that TV show where like they follow
I used to watch it. Oh yeah, totally.
Right. And they're all thrilled when they get handed their babies. Right. And then I went to hospital class, and it was like, oh, it's amazing. And everyone can breastfeed, and the baby just latches right on, and like and nobody was like really preparing you for the truth. And so yeah, when I read this, I was like, that's amazing if she had that experience, and I don't doubt her experience, but if you're reading along and you didn't have that, you're a rock star parent still, so it's all good.
Yeah. And that's it. We for the first time we had to use a minor level of fertility treatments. After that we threw everything at fertility treatments, and still we only have an only child. But when you go through fertility treatments and you have tried so freaking hard to have a baby, and then you have a baby and you're not overjoyed with it, like the amount of cultural and societal expectation of that's freaking hard. And it's okay, right? Like, and you know what, if you're listening and you're in that place, or you're getting ready to have a baby and you're afraid you're going to be in that place, please message us, either one of us, right? Like we will talk to you, like, or join our Facebook group and start a thread. Like these are real things, and we can be there for each other.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be,
because I think nobody talks about that stuff, and then you feel like you're the broken, dysfunctional one because everybody else, quote unquote, is so happy when somebody hands them this really dirty child, and you're bleeding all over the place, and you've just shit yourself on a table, and like you're supposed to be like, this is amazing, and I'm like, it might be, but it might not,
Yeah.
For the record, I was 1 in 3 with shitting myself with having children, so I didn't do every time it didn't happen, but it does happen.
I in Belgium, they at least when I was there, they did not allow that to happen. There were lots of steps taken to make sure that did not happen. They're far too refined for that.
I know. I had asked if I was like, do you do enema? They were like, no, we don't do that anymore. We just let you like crap on the table and then we just clean it up. And I was like, okay, great. Okay. Looking forward to that. That's pleasant. So,
yes.
All right. So I would love for you to do the stars conversation, Amanda. I feel like this is going to be the highlight of my day.
I will start by saying my very first comment on this chapter is, so what do you think of this idea of stars that she uses throughout this chapter? All right. So a quick overview of what it is she talks about how when your baby is born, they're like the night sky full of stars, and we think they're perfect. And every time we tell our baby not to do something, for example, don't bang on the table with your spoon, you're extinguishing one of their perfect stars in the night sky. And when they were babies, burping after dinner was a good thing, and that helped fill their night sky full of stars. And then as they get older, we tell them that a big burp after dinner is no longer a good thing, and now we've extinguished another one of their beautiful stars. And it wasn't, it gave food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
It was a new way to look at things and to think about things. And I will appreciate that, right? We discussed, I'm a silver lining person. I will appreciate a new way to look at and think about things. I'm not entirely sure that teaching a kid not to throw food at the table is extinguishing their stars. Yeah. So I'm of two minds. I'm
Yeah.
of two minds.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely had to continuously remind myself that the reason we're reading the book is to expand our horizons, because I was like, oh, okay. So
The way you were describing it before, it like at one point I was seriously like, what is this woo-woo nonsense? Like, okay, wait a minute. Like, that's not fair.
yeah.
I did think it was interesting. Like the idea, it's an interesting way to think about it. It's
Yeah.
helpful to think about it in certain
Yeah.
contexts and ways.
I think for me, it was okay. So we're in an interesting time right now, too, where the lady with the forehead tattoo is doing all the unschooling videos on TikTok, right? And like, to me, that's the example of like, we don't want to extinguish little Johnny's flames, so we're going to let him throw food at the table, right? Because that's kind of the impression that she puts out as far as like how she parents, right? Which is fine. It's just not going to work in our household, right? Like that's just not, I wouldn't feel comfortable parenting that way, but if that's what they're doing. And so my concern would be that if I didn't correct my children, that they would grow up completely feral. So, which might not be a goal of mine. So if it is for you, then that's okay. So that's part of it. But then the other part is, I think it's okay to tell your kids not to throw food at the table or bang their spoon or burp loudly at the dinner table or something. But I feel like based upon some of the stuff that she said previously is like, if you do it with mutual respect and in a kind way and, you know, in conversation, as opposed to like super disciplinary, then I feel like you can do that without extinguishing the stars, right? Like you can kind of.
I don't think so. I
not
think you're
according
supposed
to the book.
Yeah, I think you're supposed to accept the fact that you're extinguishing the stars, but be aware of what stars you're extinguishing.
Okay.
And from that regard, yes, you know, I mean, but you're right. Like just in the last chapter, right? She's like, you have to be the parent. You're not the ally. You're not their friend. You have to set boundaries. But like, know that every time you set a boundary, you've extinguished part of their sky. And now their sky is only, you know, their sky is half dark. I found that really interesting. She kept referring to the fact that the sky was half dark. I'm like, oh, well,
that's a lot of star extinguishing.
Well, it is. And how come it's not half light?
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't...
Silver lining Amanda, right? Of course she did. Yeah, I mean, so it was interesting. I had to really be very conscious during my reading to be open-minded. I'll put it that way. Yeah. And I'm working on it. Which is a good thing, right? So I'm there for it. It's good. We made a note on page 53 about, I think there was just like some cultural differences that she brought up there, but saying like that Danes don't always believe in happy endings, like, you know, that they're not constantly worried about removing challenges or worries and things like that. Like they're a little bit more grounded, maybe a little bit more analytical, a little bit more down to earth. And I think that's true sometimes in general, just like for Europeans as a whole. We are culturally very different. So she kind of points that out there.
Yeah, she does. And I do think, you know, I have said it oftentimes that I feel like Americans like want and expect happily ever after, like movies and TV shows, you know, and we really do ourselves a disservice in all of our relationships, in all of our interpersonal relationships, because we have this idea that like, well, there might be a little bit of tension in the beginning, but then it all goes away and we're happily ever after. And you never check back in at the 2-year mark and the 5-year mark and the 10-year mark. And and it sets really bad expectations for us in all kinds of ways, right?
Yep.
In all interpersonal relationships, from dating and marriage to the relationships we have with our kids and with our parents, right? And this idea that it's not always easy. It doesn't always end at the beautiful wedding day and just go on that way, bliss forever and ever, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so also on page 53, she says, I let my daughters know they can always come to me and tell me if I hurt them or push their limits too much. I will always listen to them, take their words seriously. And I really liked that, right? I think more parents should do it. I might even go so far and be Danish and say all parents should do it. I'll make it an absolute statement. But I think it takes a lot of maturity to be able to do that, right? And I know I personally, this made me really think about the fact I try to be this way and I try to show that and model it, but I think I need to actually say the words, specifically say that, like, if I hurt you, if I push you too far in any way, shape, or form, like, I want you to come and tell me, and I'll do my absolute best to just be a good listener.
Yeah. I've seen a thing online that I haven't done, but I've always liked, and I really should do it, where the parent gives their kid like a little card, kind of like a hotel key card kind of size card, but it's like cardstock or laminated or whatever. And it's like present this to me and I promise not to yell, or I promise not to get defensive, or I promise not to get angry, whatever it might be, I'm not a yeller, but like whatever it might be that is kind of like your go-to thing. And it's like that physical act of the kid like turning it over and being like, okay, and I kind of thought that was like an interesting token of exchange, where it makes you hyper aware of something at the beginning and gives the kid also the courage to walk in and because otherwise it could be hard to open the conversation.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I haven't seen that before. I love that idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, no matter what it is, I promise I won't get mad. Right. Because the reality is, like, no matter what it is, they're still your kid. Right. And so it's like, it's almost always fixable. Right. And so, and so I liked that. It kind of reminded me of this section when it was there.
And the thing is, even if it isn't fixable, there's a way through it.
Right. You'll still love your kid.
Yeah,
right?
There's a way through it. Even if you can't fix it and, put a neat bow on it, there's a way through it.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So I liked that one. And it kind of reminded me of that in that section.
So my last note or comment was just, I found this, and I'm not sad that we're reading it, but when I found it, I was specifically looking for a tween, teenager, like older kid version of that funny tongue-in-cheek bringing up Bebe book that is like an American in France who's like, and I mean, admittedly, I read that book when I was living in Belgium, which I was in Brussels in a very French culture, right? Belgium is divided, but Brussels has a strong French influence in it. And so a lot of it, there are people who are reading like, oh my gosh, that's so awful. And, the misogyny, this and the sexism, that. And like, yes. I mean, like my OBGYN was like, I'm not a big person. I'm a pretty petite person and I'm well within like a normal BMI range. Right. And she was very much like, you cannot gain more than 20 pounds with your pregnancy. And I was like, in no world is 20 pounds a normal weight to gain with a pregnancy, right? And when I went over 25 pounds while on bed rest for 12 weeks, she was like, oh no, we should probably talk about a diet. And I was like, we should probably not. Like, anything I can keep down, we will keep down, like,
I have some phentermine. It probably won't do too much damage to your baby. But as long as you look good for your husband, it'll all be fine.
I will never forget. I went for maybe like my 8 or 9 week appointment. So like I said, we had done fertility treatments and I have a lot of medical problems and I had them coming in. So I was with a high risk OBGYN and I had loads more appointments than anyone else would ever have. But it was maybe like my 8-week appointment. And she took one look at me and she said, "Oh my, your hips have already spread. You'll never fit in your pants again." And I was like, ouch. We still thought I might lose the baby. Like I still had, I mean, like there were all of these problems. And she's like, "You'll never fit in your pants again."
Let's get to the heart of the issue here. Like, right. Pretty sure I could buy new pants. Let's just get a healthy child born, okay? Like,
help me out. Help me make sure he sticks, right?
Like, oh my gosh, that's too much. Oh, I'm telling you.
So yeah, I was like, I was kind of hoping that it would be, when I picked this, that there would be like a little bit more tongue in cheek, and it's very much not tongue in cheek so
very
far.
Philosophical so far.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so far so good. I'm enjoying it. So, we'll see how it develops. I will continue to have an open mind. I've got this.
Yes, we can do this.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for our first episode of The Danish Way of Raising Teens. And
wait.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to finish it off. I never get to do the finishing, so I've got this one. Okay. Tune in next week for a continuation of the discussion. And in the meantime, happy homeschooling.
Have a great day. So glad we entertain ourselves. Hopefully they find us equally entertaining.